Howdy there. My name is Michael Dugan, coming to you live from Pascack Hills High School in Montville, New Jersey. Let's go Broncos. Today, we are going to be discussing Lesson 4D, explaining how a narrator's reliability affects a narrative. Without further ado, let's dive into today's lesson. Now, what will we learn today? First of all, we will learn how we can detect bias in an unreliable narrator. Next, we will dive into how the reliability of a narrator affects different aspects of the narrative. Finally, we will investigate how the knowledge of unreliability in narration can affect our analysis of a story using a passage from J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye to help us along our learning journey. Let's dive in. To begin and understand bias in a work of literature, we first need to understand point of view. We learned earlier in the year that point of view is the perspective in which a story is told. Different characters have different perspectives and therefore tell different stories. For example, imagine if you heard the story of an argument between two of your friends from each of your friends. However, although each story covered the same event, you noticed some important differences between the retellings. The use of hyperbole, understatement, or even plain omission are often the reason for these discrepancies. In this instance, each friend is an unreliable narrator in the story of this argument. You are receiving a retelling of some true event in a different way based on who told the story. Each friend has a bias towards themselves and their own actions within the argument, which will reflect in the stories you hear. Now, how does this come into play in literature? Oftentimes, an author will write their stories with an unreliable narrator. Why might they do this? There are several reasons. Unreliable narration can be a method of plot development as readers learn crucial information either at the same time as the narrators or omitted information due to a narrator's bias. This creates tension and intrigue for readers as their understanding of a story or situation shifts as the narrative goes on. Unreliable narration can also serve as a method to show character development, shown through the shifts as a narrator progresses throughout a story. Regardless of the purpose, an unreliable narrator can greatly influence the meaning and progression of a story. Now that we know what unreliable narration is and why an author may use it, let's talk about how we can detect bias in the stories that we read. As I stated before, unreliable narrators often use tools of exaggeration, which will reveal their bias. Always look out for hyperbole, understatement, omission, or generalization. Secondly, we can identify bias in a narrator by keeping their pasts in mind. Are there any events before the scope of the story that may cause them to tell events in a certain way? Always consider the context in which a speaker is telling a story. This is a tool crucial in literary analysis. Finally, keeping track of details. Making sure to pay attention to little details can help reveal contradictions and eventually reveal bias to a reader. It's time for some practice. We will read this passage from The Catcher in the Rye together and then work together to find bias and discuss how this bias may affect the story the narrator is telling. For some context, Holden Caulfield, the narrator, has failed all his classes, and his sister Phoebe begins to question him on it. He responds, "Oh God, Phoebe, don't ask me. I'm sick of everybody asking me that. It was one of the worst schools I ever went to. It was full of phonies and mean guys. You never saw so many mean guys in your life. They had this goddamn secret fraternity I was too yellow not to join." Let's first consider Caulfield's past. He failed nearly every class and as a result was expelled from his school, Pensy Prep. We also know from the events of this novel that he is not proud about this happening. We can see how he paints this story to his little sister. He begins by being defensive, stating, "Oh God," and "Don't ask me." Later, Caulfield states the school was full of phonies and mean guys, an exaggeration. Finally, Caulfield's actions contradict his words, as he joined the fraternity of mean guys and phonies because he was too yellow-bellied. Through the detection of this bias, we can analyze this passage and story as a whole. Clearly, Caulfield is upset about his expulsion and tells a story that isn't entirely accurate, identifying him as an unreliable narrator. We can now use this gained knowledge and use it as in analysis of the rest of the story. We know all the events told by Caulfield are not necessarily free of exaggeration nor unbiased. Therefore, the detection of bias and unreliable narration has clued us into more information about the story we read. Finally, what are our key takeaways for this lesson? Firstly, unreliable narrators often tell stories plagued with bias. In order to find the truth of a story, we must look beyond this bias. Through analyzing the language a narrator uses, their reliability can be determined. We discussed that the four major literary devices unreliable narrators use are hyperbole, understatement, omission, or generalization. As well as this, always consider the context in which a narrator tells a story. Finally, stories told by unreliable narrators should be analyzed differently given the knowledge that all information told is not entirely and necessarily accurate. Complete consideration of all aspects of narration, including reliability, provides an elite analysis of any story we read throughout this entire course. Therefore, it is paramount that we consider the reliability of our narrator. With that being said, I would like to conclude this video by giving a big thank you to you, the listener. Thank you very much for listening, and have a great night. Good night.